So she bought me a personalized video where Colin Mockery says, "Dave, I've heard you're as handsome as I am," and it's just wonderful.
Man, that's funny.
Oh, he was very funny. It was a wonderful gift.
I went to during the pandemic, I went to a conference where Colin was the keynote speaker. So it was really fun to hear him. He's a really interesting guy.
So I see we're about to kick off. Are you
Yeah,
going to introduce me, or how does
yeah,
this
you
work?
bet. Yes.
Okay, good.
And I'll make it quick. I'd like to turn it over to you as fast as possible. So I'll make it quick. And I'll load up your, do you want me to just load that up? I'll probably wait 5 minutes if that's okay. Or if you want to just signal me to load up
No, go ahead and load it up. Just say, in your intro, just say, and here's the slides. That's fine.
okay. Yeah. And there are slides, is that what they're? I didn't actually open them over.
Yeah, it's just a copy of the slides that they'll be seeing.
Great, fantastic.
Hello to David and Brian. We are going live on YouTube as well.
All right.
We just a few more seconds for the session to go live. Have a great session ahead.
Thank you, Parash.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start this session now. Have a great one. Take care.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in just a moment. I'd like to give people just a moment to join. We have lots of folks joining right now. Welcome to our faculty webinar. It's a good one, so you'll be glad that you're here. All right. And you might want to, just as a reminder, you can open up the chat window and make sure that blue bar right above where you type in messages says everyone. It pops up as a default with host and panelists, but you want to change that to everyone. All right. Let's go ahead and get started now. Thanks for joining, everybody. We got a great faculty webinar today with David Robertson. I was going to talk today about Lego. It's always a fascinating discussion. David is a senior lecturer at MIT and also a professor of practice at the Wharton School. So spends a bit of time teaching folks and also some time talking about Lego. I know he has a special relationship with Lego. So without any further ado, oh, one other quick thing. I'm going to wait just a moment until we get everybody here, but I will load up the slides into chat so that all of you can follow along with David's talk. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over. Please welcome David Robertson. Great to have you here.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And let me share my screen. And Brian, do you see a bunch of ninjas, Lego ninjas?
I do.
Okay, good. So we're all here. Okay, good. Yeah. So I'm Dave Robertson, and like Brian said, I teach at the Sloan School. I do still have a part-time appointment at Wharton, but I'm not a professor of practice there anymore. I'm just an adjunct. I still teach a little bit there. But before that, I was the Lego Professor of Innovation at a Swiss business school called IMD. and I got inside access to the world of Lego, and wandered around the world for 5 years. I ended up writing a book about Lego called Brick by Brick. This came out, almost 10 years ago, but it was about Lego's near death and spectacular recovery. I really felt like it was a wonderful case study that anybody can learn from. And in particular, people like you. So we're going to talk about Lego. I wrote a follow-on book, for what it's worth, called The Power of Little Ideas. And this was an answer to a question from a group kind of like yourselves, more experienced people, where they said, Lego made a really spectacularly successful change to the way it did innovation as a result of a crisis. They were almost bankrupt, and they realized they needed to do things differently, and they found a way to do things differently. And they all went for it. But me and our company, we're not in crisis. We're not facing bankruptcy, and it's a lot harder to get people to change. So how could we do what Lego did in our company? And the answer to that question is my follow-on book called The Power of Little Ideas. But really, this is why I wrote the book about Lego. This was Lego's entire sales history up through 2016. And by the way, what happens after 2016 is just as interesting, but we don't have time for it. But in particular, I want to focus on this period here. This peak. They never reached 10 billion in Danish kroner in sales. And by the way, there's like 5 to 7 Danish kroner, even 9 Danish kroner to the dollar or euro. But then they fell almost 40% just in a few years and almost went bankrupt in 2003 and 2004. And so we're going to talk about that because they learned some lessons. It took them a while to implement those. But starting in 2007, you can see there really is this hockey stick. And they had 8 years of 24% per year sales growth on average and 36% profit growth. I see I've got a hand raised. Question? Unmute or type it in. Okay, just type it in chat. I'll try and watch chat, and Brian will watch chat. Okay, so I want to pick up the story in 1978. So 1978 is when the grandson of the founder of Lego was founded back in 1932. And in the early 50s, the founder turned it over to his son, a guy named Godfred Kirk Christiansen. And he was the one that invented and patented the Lego brick as we know it. That was patented in 1958. And steadily moved the company to just being brick-based toys. This is a picture from the cover of from an advertisement. And this is young Kjell Kirk, who we see now at age 32, taking over the reins of power at this family-owned business in Denmark. Now, these two guys did not get along at all. The father and the son really bickered quite a lot because the son had just come back from my old business school. Again, that's IMD in Switzerland. He'd gotten his MBA in the early 70s, and he came back with all these ideas about, what we should do to really make this into a modern company. His father, though, was quite conservative, grew up in the Depression years of the 30s, never took out a loan, was very slow to adopt any changes. When I talked to the grandson as part of the book, he told me the story of how it took him 6 years to convince his father to put green in the inventory, to make green bricks. It took him 6 years to make the case to do that. And generally, if you wanted any new shape or color, you had to get it approved by the CEO in those years of the 60s or early 70s. So when the son, the grandson of the founder took over, when Kjell Kirk Christiansen took over, he unleashed this wave of innovation. He had all these ideas that he wanted to try, and it was spectacularly successful. So in particular, there was a couple things that happened. One was technique. So technique was a different building system that used pins and beams to attach things together. So it was a different way of attaching plastic pieces to each other. But it also had gears and motors and axles, and so you could make very sophisticated creations. The idea being that, a few years before, in 1969, Lego had introduced Duplo. If you're not familiar, Duplo is intended for toddlers, like 2 to 4 year olds, and has much bigger pieces that you don't have to worry about them swallowing it. It's easier for them to manipulate. And that had been very successful at moving Lego from that traditional 5 to 9 year old demographic down to 2 to 4 year old. Well, Technique, they thought, would move Lego and, beyond that age 9, 10, 11, into where teenagers would want to play with it. And for the most part, that failed. The teenagers don't play with Lego, still don't play with Lego. But there's a group of 25 to 55-year-old men that do, and so Technique did spectacularly well. Probably the bigger innovation, though, that happened the following year, 1978, was the first minifigure, right? Technique comes out in 77. In 1978, they introduced the minifigure. This was the first minifigure, although there were some others that happened soon after. And the minifigure really changed the play experience. It allowed, you can see some of these old Lego sets, which were, houses and fire trucks and things like that. And those were quite popular. But if you could put a little minifigure into the story and really play around with it, it really changed the play experience in a pretty important and dramatic way. And so that was a big change. But the third change was almost as important, which was the first fantasy sets were introduced in 1978. Before 1978, all Lego sets were kind of in present day towns and cities, right? It was things like fire trucks and police stations and gas stations and apartment buildings and things like that. The space set and the castle set that came out in 1978 were hugely popular. And in fact, if you have those in your basement or your attic, they're worth thousands of dollars to collectors. They're just so, they were so successful and became their own toy lines. And those three innovations of Technique and the minifigure and the fantasy sets launched Lego on a 15-year period of 14% annual growth. In other words, Lego doubled in size every 5 years for 15 years between 1978 and 1993. And it really was just a golden period. They expanded into North America. Every year was a new play theme, like pirates or Wild West or trains or robots or something like that. The public snapped them up, and Lego could do no wrong. And it was just kind of pure product development. That was their innovation: is let's think of a new play theme. Let's come up with a couple sets around that play theme. Let's introduce them into the market, and people snapped them up. That worked spectacularly well for 15 years, and then it stopped. So in the mid 90s, right? So this was 78 through 93, going back to this chart. But you can see from 93 through 98, really there's no growth, no appreciable growth at all. So what would you do? Lego is this family-owned business in this small town in Denmark that was run by the grandson of the founder. And so this really was an individual decision in many ways. And he had to decide, what is Lego going to do? Like, it's been a very successful 15 years up until 1993, and very flat since then. Well, what Lego did is something that a lot of companies do, and it's been called the disease of more. And basically, if one new product is good, then two new products is better. And I heard that this happened. So I went back, I got all the catalogs from each year. I checked, I counted. There was 109 new Lego sets in 1994. There was 347 in 1998. From 109 to 347, and more than tripled. But sales don't go anywhere. What do you think happens to production complexity? What do you think happens to work in process inventory? What do you think happens to overall manufacturing and supply chain costs, right? And so costs go up, sales don't go anywhere. So what happens to profits? They plummet. Lego suffers its first loss in company history in 1998. They end up having to lay off 1,000 people. Now, think about that. Bill in Denmark today is only about 19,000 people. It is this tiny little town. It's a company town. And so you are the CEO of this company that really controls this town, this company in this town. And you've got to lay off 1,000 people. Think how traumatic that must be. And, in fact, you're laying off the parents of your kids' friends. It was really a difficult thing. And so Kjell Kirk Christiansen, again, I talked to him. He said, I'd been running the company for 20 years, 15 of them quite successfully. The last 5, not so much. And I thought maybe I'm not the right guy to run the company for the next 20 years. And so he stepped aside. He brought in a turnaround expert from a company called Bang & Olufsen. A guy named Paul Plowman had just turned around the high-end Danish consumer electronics company, Bang & Olufsen. And he thought, well, this guy's technology, he's sophisticated with technology. He understands what it's like to turn around an aging brand. He's perfect for Lego. And so Paul Plowman comes in, brings in his team, and they look at what's happening in the market. And what they found is that in the 90s, the market changed in some pretty fundamental ways. One was the rise of the digital, right? So play experiences were really changing. There was PlayStation, there was Nintendo, there was Xbox hadn't come out yet, Sega. But kids were increasingly pulled away from traditional toys, not just Lego, but, Barbie, Hot Wheels, Meccano, Erector sets, Lincoln Logs, you name it, right? All the traditional toys were being disrupted by these digital play experiences. But another thing that was happening is a change in the distribution channel. That before in the 80s, 70s, 60s, it was smaller mom and pop toy stores on the corner. In the US especially, but also France, Germany, UK, there was these big box stores. Toys R Us, for example, in the US was the peak of its powers. And they really had a lot of market power, and they could say, Lego, I know you want us to carry this, but we're going to carry that because we understand your customer, and maybe better than you do. They were very sophisticated about understanding their markets and what sold and when did it sell and how did it sell well. Another significant change that had happened is during the 90s, there was a lot of outsourcing to China. And so, say in the US, Mattel and Hasbro were moving their production to China. And so in the biggest market of the US and North America more generally, other toys that you could buy were getting cheaper. Lego was still made in high-cost Denmark, and the Danish kroner right at this period at the end of the 90s was getting stronger against the dollar. So Lego was getting more expensive, whereas the other toys you could buy were getting less expensive. And so it's kind of a double hit there. And then lastly, the Lego brick was patented in 1958. So all the patents ran out in 85, in the mid-80s, some in 85, some later. And so to this day, you go to any store that sells Lego, and right next to Lego on the shelf is another brick that looks like Lego, snaps together with Lego, and costs half as much or less. And in some cases the quality is approaching Lego. Lego is very high quality. It's still the high quality product on the market, but some of these others are pretty good. What do you do, right? I mean, this is a tough market. And before I move on, this was 1999. 2 years before, in 1997, a Harvard Business School professor named Clayton Christensen had published a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. And The Innovator's Dilemma really argued for disruptive technologies, that there was this thing called disruptive technologies. And they use as an example, digital photography, but they also talked about other things such as mini electric arc furnaces for steel mills and disk drives and so forth. And what they argued was that some of these new technologies didn't start out being very good, but they really changed very rapidly. And before you knew it, if you were in a disrupted market, you were out of business. And so Lego became convinced that they were being disrupted. And so they really pushed to change the company. Paul Plowman went and said, we've got to really think about new types of play experiences. We've got to reinvent the future of play. And so they changed their mission statement. We want the Lego brand to become the world's strongest brand among families with children by 2005. And inside the company, they said, we've got to explore new types of play experiences. We can't just be about plastic bricks because that's a commodity and we're being disrupted. And I'll ask you later what's wrong about this. But they were by far not the only company that thought that the digital was going to disrupt the physical. And so I'm spending time on this to reinforce something that these were not dumb people that didn't care about their market and were careless. These were thoughtful people that really cared about making a great play experiences and did the best they could. And we know what happens next, right? They go into the next thing, which almost bankrupts them. So let me give you a feel for the kinds of play experiences they introduced over the next couple of years, right? So now we're right in the new millennium. We're right in early 2000. They come out with Galador in 2001. Now, what was different about Galador was, number one, it's an action figure, and that's very popular at that point. But they also embed in the toys these sensors, and the sensors can detect ultrasonic signals. They go out to Hollywood and they commission a live action TV show called Galador, Defenders of the Outer Dimension. And they embed in the TV show ultrasonic sounds so that you and I can't hear them, but the toy picks it up and it talks back to the TV show. If you watch the show with your toy, it'll actually talk back to the TV show. And so it creates this immersive experience where the toy is actually participating and you feel like you're in this conversation with the TV show. They did the same with a video game. There was like a spaceship with little electronic games on it. And they just created this amazing immersive experience. They did a lot of market research. They found that most kids actually don't like construction toys. And so they thought, well, let's expand the market. Let's show kids how much fun construction toys can be. And so what they did is they created something called the Jack Stone line. And what was different about Jack Stone is that the pieces were much bigger. Instead of having 100 pieces, it would have something like 20 or 25 pieces. And you can see they have these big kind of chunky pieces that snap together very quickly. And so you build something very quickly, and then it's more about play and less about a complex, time-consuming construction experience. And they thought, well, we'll get people hooked on the Lego construction experience, and then they'll start buying more Lego. And each one had an adventure. This was a fire rescue set. They explored electronic toys for that 2 to 4 year old demographic. They thought, not many people there's lots of electronic toys on the market, like from VTech and other companies like that, but there's not a lot for the 2 to 4 year old market. So they introduced something called the music roller, and you plug in a mushroom in the center of it. The toddler drags it behind themselves, and it plays a different song depending on what mushroom you plug in the middle. They create a story builder, and they have this kind of modular thing where you put in 3 different cards, and depending what cards you choose and what order you choose them in, it'll tell you a different story. So electronic toys for that 2 to 4 year old market. They come up, they've had a Legoland in Denmark since the 60s, and it was a way, like for people that visit the headquarters, it's a way for them to see a little bit more. And they think, well, if we're gonna reintroduce the brand and relaunch this brand in a new way, we need ways to explain that brand. We need a more experiential play experience. And so they open up Legolands in California, in the UK, near Heathrow Airport, down in Munich. Germans love Lego, highest per capita consumption of any country in the world. And so they open up 3 new Legoland theme parks. And they come out with Bionicle, which, Bionicle was a box of plastic pieces that snapped together, but it used a new attachment mechanism, the ball and socket joint, as well as some Technique pins. And so it didn't look like any Lego before or since. They even explored virtual Lego building. So they created a three-dimensional computer-aided design system called Lego Digital Designer, where you could actually snap together pieces in 3 dimensions. And then later, not in this period, 2001, 2002, they connected this to a fulfillment operation. So you could upload your designs. They would mail you for a fee just the pieces you needed to build those designs. And you could sell your design to other people around the world. And so they created this online community of designers around this three-dimensional building environment. And then lastly, in 1999, for the first time, they attached their somebody else's story to their brand. 1999 was the episode 1. It was the first movie in the second Star Wars trilogy. And that was the first Lego Star Wars toys in 1999. 2 years later was the first Harry Potter. And so they did it again. They attached somebody else's story to Lego toys and created Lego Harry Potter. And it all worked until it didn't. And let's do a poll here. If you could launch the poll, please. I'm curious what you think. Lego was doing all this because in 1999, they really believed that the brick, the traditional Lego toy, was becoming a commodity. And if all they did was offer another box of bricks, which again had been really successful between 78 and 93, but if all they offered was another box of bricks, they'd become a commodity, if not bankrupt. Was that the wrong problem statement? And so what they believed was that they needed to reinvent the future of play. And so they did these experiments that I just showed you a sample of. And so, did they solve the wrong problem, or did they solve the right problem, but just chose the wrong solutions? Or did they choose, good solutions, but maybe executed them badly? What do you think was the mistake that they made? It was one of these, right? I mean, to some degree, it's all of them, of course, but it's one of them more than the others. And so let's see, is the poll? There should be a poll.
People will need to click that poll button on the bottom to open that poll up and answer the question.
Yeah. There seems to be a consensus already, though. That there was more a consensus on the first one. They killed the goose. Nisreen, I think they badly wounded the goose, but they didn't kill it, thankfully. Okay. Can we see the results? How does that happen? Sorry, I've never done a poll, so.
I don't know either. Maybe, there we go. There's the results. They just popped up.
Okay. There we go. It looks like it is a consensus on the first one, with some people 4 thinking it's the second one, and one brave soul choosing the third one. Okay. For reasons that I'll get into, I believe that the best answer is the second one, that they tried to solve the right problem but chose the wrong solutions. And again, the problem, as I stated it, was, and that they believed was, if all they offered was another box of bricks, they'd become a commodity, if not bankrupt. I think that was true, that was a problem. But their solutions were the wrong ones. So let me explain what happened next. With this, is there a question? Type your question into chat. I see your hands going up, but type your question into chat if you have it, and I'll try and monitor that, and Brian will monitor that. Okay, so the Lego Explore electronic toys, I think these would have been good toys if they'd had a different brand, right? If these had been Fisher Price, they would have done terrifically well. They were actually really good toys. But the problem was that they weren't Lego toys. A brand is a really great thing, and Lego's brand was powerful and remains very powerful, but it means something. And a brand lets you do some things and doesn't let you do others. And nobody believed Lego could do this well, and nobody wanted Lego to do this. And so these toys just didn't succeed. People would see them in stores and just kind of get confused, like, what? That's Lego? And walk away. Nobody would buy it. Jack Stone was a different problem. Jack Stone was, again, a Lego for kids that don't like construction toys. And when I phrase it that way, you can kind of guess what happened, that kids who don't like construction toys aren't going to buy a box of plastic pieces that snap together. It didn't expand the market at all, which was its intent. And the kids that did like, or the adults that did like a really kind of rewarding, complex construction experience, they bought the Jack Stone and they felt insulted. They literally insulted. Like, what are you doing? Right? This isn't Lego. There's no, snap together and all the fun's gone. Right? So all it did was it turned away its best customers at a time when they needed them most. Galador was a different set of problems. First, of course, nobody wanted an action figure from Lego. Nobody believed it. Nobody thought that they'd do a good job with it. But also, when they went out to Hollywood and commissioned a TV show, you can look this up on IMDb, it was such a bad show that almost everybody who acted in it never acted in anything ever again. I mean, it wasn't just bad. It was so bad it killed the careers of the people involved, and ended up a very expensive failure. Lego just got itself into a business it didn't understand, commissioning TV shows and things like that. And then Lego Star Wars and Lego Harry Potter. Surprisingly, I believe one of the reasons that Lego almost went bankrupt, or one of the primary reasons Lego almost went bankrupt. And the reason why is, I don't know if you tried to buy a Lego toy back in December of 1999. If you did, and I remember this clearly, what you saw was, a couple feet, like a meter of empty shelf space where the Lego Star Wars toys were supposed to be in December of 1999. They didn't expect how popular they would be. They sold out. And, Lego, stocking out is the worst thing that can happen. Lego's fundamental business model, or it used to be until the price of oil went up, was they would buy ABS plastic at about $1 a pound or €2 per kilo. And they'd sell it to us for 50 times that, $50 a pound or €100 per kilo. That's about what a Lego set used to cost. With that kind of model, I don't know who is an operations specialist, but it doesn't take one to realize with that kind of model, you want to make too much of something and throw away the extra rather than miss a sale. Because all of their costs are fixed costs. I mean, it's almost like a software business where all of your cost is designing the toy, and the cost per unit is fairly low in comparison. And so the following year in 2000, what happened was, what do you think happened, right? They made more, right? They upped production, but there was no movie, and they didn't understand how cyclical the demand would be. Right, how much greater the demand would be in years with a movie than when there wasn't a movie. And so now there's way too much in the market. They're discounting the toys, they're returning them. They made way too much of it. The next year was a Harry Potter, and so those did very well. In 2002, there was another Star Wars movie and another Harry Potter movie, but there was no movie of either franchise in 2003 or the first half of 2004. Sales of those two toys fell off a cliff. 94% of the other toys, which I showed you some of, were unprofitable, and the company almost went bankrupt. That they hit a peak in 2001 of 10.1 billion Danish kroner. They fell to 6.3 billion, from 10.1 to 6.3 in just 3 years, and the company almost went bankrupt. And so let me tell you why and what they learned, because there was one shining success in all of this mess that happened between 99 and 2002, and that was Bionicle. Bionicle was the toy that saved Lego in two very important ways. Maybe the most important was it sold a lot of very profitable toys at a time when nothing else was working. So without the revenues from Bionicle in 2003 and 2004, the company would not be alive today. But more importantly, Bionicle taught them something about how they needed to develop toys in the future. So what was interesting about Bionicle was it came out in 2001. It was designed by the people who had done the Star Wars toys in 1999, 2 years before. And they thought, well, what if we make our own epic story of good versus evil, of these heroes battling this evil force? But we make our own story, so we don't have to send big payments to somebody else like LucasArts, or the Harry Potter people. And so they created this whole epic story of Bionicles, of these heroes that wash up on the island of Matanui. This is the original concept art from a guy named Christian Faber. And they have adventures in different parts of the island. And they also made it a collectible. So every year there was a different story in a different part of the island, and different characters that would evolve every year. And so if you didn't get the Bionicles, the 6 heroes and the 6 bad guys from say 2002, well then on January 1st of 2003, there'd be a whole new set of characters with a different story in a different place, right? They go up in the air, they go underwater, they go on a separate island, they go in caves underneath the original island. And so the collectible coupled with the epic story really made this toy a huge hit. They sold 190 million of these action figures. It was the first buildable action figure ever, and it saved Lego. And what Lego learned was that they started spinning off other things. So the most popular comic books in the world were the DC comics about Bionicle. And when kids, or the most popular books, were the young adult fiction books for many years, were the scholastic books about Bionicle. And when kids read those books or the comic books, they really understood the story in more depth. And that led to not just, of course, the licensing revenue that Scholastic would pay back to Bionicle, or DC Comics would pay back to Bionicle, but also it would get kids to, and my son was this age, would get kids to save up their money so that they had all 6 of the good guys and all 6 of the bad guys and could play out the story. The PC games that they brought out for Bionicle were very popular, as was the direct-to-DVD movies, as was the clothing and accessories, right? And kids would wear the Bionicle backpack or the T-shirt or whatever, and they become walking advertisements. It would bring in licensing revenues. It would tell other kids about it. And all these things really created this virtuous spiral where more and more sales resulted in more and more revenues and more sales and so forth. But they learned a really valuable lesson, especially from the PC games and the other digital offerings, is that they weren't disruptive. They weren't disruptive, right? When kids played the PC games, they wanted more boxes of overpriced plastic pieces, not fewer. And so they were complementary. And that's why I said it's the second one. Remember, the second one was they were solving the right problem, but they chose the wrong solutions, right? The problem was, if all we offer is another box of plastic pieces that snap together, we're going to become a commodity, if not bankrupt. That was absolutely true. But by looking outside of the plastic brick and the detailed construction experience, and trying to do all these other things like action figures and electronic toys, basically nobody wanted that from Lego, and nobody bought it from Lego. When they came back to their core of creating an interesting construction experience using plastic pieces, and then also created these complementary innovations that helped tell a story and build a world that kids wanted to play in, that's when kids returned to the brand. And so they chose the wrong solutions. Right? Fundamentally the wrong solutions by moving away from the construction experience, the creative construction experience. So Bodo asks, did they repeat this with Ninjago? Yes, and Bodo. They really not just repeated it, but really made it an institutionalized part of the company, a regular part of the company. So when they were surveying the wreckage of these experiments in 2004 and 2005, and they saw this one shining success, they realized this is the way we need to do product development. And so their design thinking process, which by the way happened before there was such a thing as design thinking, was very much about this idea of, well, let's go out and let's really understand what the market wants. Let's go out and do that kind of open-ended anthropological inquiry to really understand how kids are playing and what the themes are. And let's come back with some insights, and then let's develop a new play theme. And then let's propose that to management, and then let's go out and test it. Let's try it with kids, see what they do, and come back, and then we'll loop again, right? So we'll go through this loop a couple of times and really finally develop it. So this is their way of representing the process. The way it actually played out, though, was very different than the way Lego used to develop products. So this is the cartoons that the Ninjago team gave me. And this is what they showed to kids. The previous process for Lego that they used in the 70s and 80s was they get different groups together and they'd have them propose a toy. And they'd have a big meeting in a big open auditorium. And they'd have the management team go around and they'd look and they'd say, oh, that looks like a good toy. Let's bring that one to market. Or no, that's not ready yet. Why don't you develop it? Or no, that doesn't look like it's going to work. So no, thank you. Lego became much more humble about its innovation process. So when they were thinking about what's the next play theme, what they did is they got a bunch of kids together around a table and they showed them pictures one at a time. And they'd say, tell us a story. What's happening in this picture? And, Lego has this great expression. There's only two groups of honest people in the world, kids and drunks. Kids will never lie to you about whether something's famous. And so whether something's fun. And so they'd show them, this underwater thing. I think this actually became Atlantis. And then this one, there's others, but kids really seem to like this idea of ninjas. And so the old Lego would have gone off and developed, a ninja toy, right? I mean, they see this, kids are really getting excited and telling lots of stories and there's lots of things going on with ninjas. But the new Lego, they're much more humble. And so they went back and they said, well, what kind of ninja? Is it like ninjas battling these bad guys with more modern things like motorcycles and helicopters, or is it more fantasy related? With lizards and dragons and things like that. And so what kind of experience are we talking about? Mummies and ancient dead people, that kind of thing. What kind of experience are we talking about? And they realized they didn't know who the force of evil was, right? If ninjas were the force for good, who did ninjas battle? And so again, they went back to the kids and they said, if ninjas are the good, the force for good, who's the force for evil? And can you guess? I should have done a poll here, and it's not really important enough to do a poll. But kids have a very clear logic. A 7-year-old brain has a very clear logic that since ninjas were real historical figures, it couldn't be something like robots or lizards or monkeys. It had to be skeletons. I mean, the feedback was really strong. It had to be skeletons. And so what kind of skeleton? They showed them that, and they created this whole thing about, Lord Garmadon and the skeleton army and the 6 golden weapons. And then they stole this idea of spinjitzu, where you have spinners and one pops off before the other. There was something called Beyblades at the same time, so that they'll never admit it, but they kind of stole the idea from another toy. And they created a TV show, a good one this time. They hired people rather than try to do it themselves. They hired people who knew how to do a good cartoon show. And they created video games, they created books, they created events at the Lego store where you could learn spinjitzu and compete against other kings. And all this made this box of plastic pieces irresistible. It was a tremendous success. And so I see Bodo asked, why did it have to be skeletons? Are there any reasons for that? Well, that's what kids felt was who ninjas would have battled was the skeletons. Ask a 7-year-old, Bodo. I can't explain it, but and so all this kind of let me move it forward a bit. So Ninjago was 2011. 2017 they introduced the Lego Batman movie. Now 2014 was the Lego movie, and what they did is they went out rather than try and create their own feature-length movie. They went to the team that did Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. If you're not familiar, it's a movie with that right kind of snarky, sarcastic, 7-year-old sense of humor. And so they got that same team to do the Lego movie in 2014. In that movie, they introduced the Lego Batman character. There's no sound to this, to the program support. I took out the sound so I could talk over it. But, Lego Batman has all these adventures, and it's all created in this Lego-y world. And when the movie comes out, there's all kinds of toys, right? There's a dozen toys in the stores. There's comic books, there's video games, they've taken it a step further. Lego Batman had his own Instagram channel where he posted his vacation photos. He had a Facebook page. He had a Snapchat lens. If it was today, I'm sure he'd have, his own TikTok channel. There was even a little Easter egg. If you had an iPhone in 2017, from February 2017 when the movie came out through February 2019, 2 years later, if you talk to your iPhone the way Lego Batman talked to his, and Lego Batman had an iPhone, right? I mean, kids get phones at that same age. Well, then your iPhone would have talked to you like you were Lego Batman. It would have said things like, "How can I help you, Lego Batman? I'm at your service, Lego Batman." Your iPhone would have said that to you. And I tested it. It worked in French. It worked in Portuguese. It worked in Spanish. It worked in many different languages. There was events at the Lego store. There was Happy Meal toys at McDonald's. There was books. There was web apps. And all of this made those toys supremely successful. And so, the way I like to simplify and explain this is that Lego had 15 years of 14% annual growth by innovating inside the box, by just coming out with a better version or a newer version of its product. That worked really well for 15 years, but nothing lasts forever. Competition caught up, patents expired, and Lego's sales flattened. They, after trying to do more and more products and realizing that just resulted in more and more costs, but not more and more revenues, then they start to think, let's innovate outside the box. Let's really try new things. Let's reinvent the future of play. Let's disrupt ourselves before somebody else does, like many companies were doing in the late 90s. Well, innovating outside the box almost put Lego out of business. They had some good ideas like Bionicle, but a lot of failures and very expensive failures, which is what often happens when you try and do something genuinely disruptive. And so they came back to the core of who Lego was, and they innovated around the box. So they took that box of Lego and realized it wasn't enough to just offer another box of bricks, that they had to really tell a story in Lego's case, and they had to build a world that kids wanted to play in. And when they did that through complementary innovations, that's when they returned. That's when kids returned to the brand, adults returned to the brand, and that's when sales skyrocketed. Yeah. So Yira asks, it's quite a jump to bet 100% on kids' recommendations, even if they are customers. Were there any rejections in the company or other considerations against it? Well, okay, yeah. Lego continues to have failures, but the thing is, who are you going to ask? Are you going to ask a 50-something Danish product developer who lives in a small town in Denmark about what 7-year-old kids are going to like in the United States? Or are you going to ask a 7-year-old United States kid? It turns out that it's much more reliable to actually ask a 7-year-old United States kid. And there's all kinds of academic research to support this, that generally asking your customer is better than than debating it internally. And this is part of what you're learning, isn't it? I mean, this is part of design thinking, is to be humble about your ability to predict the success of a product idea or a service idea. And then, in fact, you should show it to your customer. You should learn from that. And if it's not working, you should pivot from it. And Lego has created a process where that's required for any team developing a new toy. And so I like to summarize this whole thing by saying that you can look at innovation as dating or fighting. You can look at it as fighting your competitor, right? So we're trying to we're developing a new product, say, and we can look and you can see there's competitors out in the market, and what features do they have? What do they cost? Well, how can we do it better? Well, then if we do that, then they're going to respond to us and they're going to fight us and they're going to make theirs slightly better, faster, or cheaper. And so we go back and forth and everybody becomes a commodity, and it becomes a miserable market. If instead we think about, well, who is our customer? How do we date our customer? When you met that special person in your life and you wanted to have more of a relationship with them, you tried to understand who they were, what they cared about and what their hopes and passions and fears and dreams were. And you tried to understand their life and become a bigger part of their life. Well, that's the way we should look about it at innovation. Like, how do kids play? What do they really care about? How do we make it a more complete experience? That's what Lego is. That's what innovating around the box is. Like, just coming out with a box of bricks isn't enough. We have to complement it with maybe comic books, maybe TV shows, maybe movies, maybe video games, to tell a story and build a world that kids want to play in. And when we do that, they'll come to our products. So let me stop there, because that's really what I wanted to cover, and that's about what we have time to cover. I'll stop there. How does crowdsourcing fit into that? So Lego Ideas is what Lego learned from this and from others is that they needed to be humble about their ability to predict what their customers wanted. And in particular, they started really experimenting with, well, what kinds of products do customers want? Well, maybe we should have our customers propose new product ideas. And they've really taken that further. And now they have the Lego Ideas competition, where they're continually asking their customers to come up with product ideas. Their customers will go through a vetting process to say, hey, that's a great idea. We should do that. We should do a Lego Minecraft toy. We should do a Lego Doctor Who toy. And they create those and they bring those to market, and it's done quite well. And so they've this opening up process that I described the beginning of is now in full force now. And they're actually doing kind of a Kickstarter version of it, where they'll say, hey, here's a couple ideas. Which one of these would you buy if we actually made it? And so rather than actually decide something and then bring it to market, they say, okay, here's 3. Why don't you decide which one you're actually going to buy? Commit to buying it. And then once we get enough commitments, we'll actually bring it to market. Fascinating thing. So yeah, crowdsourcing is something that they've continually pushed forward on. Nizreen, why did customers accept Lego movies but not Lego digital toys? Yeah, so that's where this next step. I remember I said that what happens after 2016 is just as interesting as what happened before. I think Lego, and I know when I was a parent, I bought Lego to get kids off screens. And so, some of the toys, Nexo Knights, for example, came out a couple of years ago, and they had a little, it wasn't a QR code, but it was kind of like that. And what they would do is they would say, if you buy these minifigures and you scan the QR codes, you get new powers, and you can use them for your figure in this online game. And generally, so they tried to mix the physical with the digital. And generally, parents buy Lego to get their kids off screens. It didn't do that well. On the other hand, movies do well. Some of these play experience, like theme parks and discovery centers, you can look up discovery centers. It's a really fascinating experiment in retail, where they'll take over a former, J.C. Penney or Sears that's gone out of business, and they'll turn it into an indoor playground. Those have done tremendously well. And Lego is now the second largest operator of theme parks in the world, second only to Disney. A lot of people in Lego and out have said, boy, you should become more digital, more, integrate the digital and physical experience and compete against Sega, Nintendo, Xbox, PlayStation, etc. Generally, when they've tried to go that direction, they've failed. On the other hand, whenever they've gone closer to Disney and created physical experiences, movies, video games, but also theme parks and stores and things like that, whenever they've gone that direction, they've done really well. So I think they're increasingly being pulled by their customers, sometimes against their will, to compete against Disney, not against Xbox or PlayStation.
Dave, there's a question from Mumby further up earlier in the chat. I can read it to you if you're looking for it. It says, was there a significant shift in the Lego culture for this to work, and how did they go about it?
Yeah, it's like that old phrase, sometimes to manage change, you have to change managers. So they did. There was a lot of managers that left the company after this transition. The human side of it was quite difficult and disruptive. But the cultural change in general, Lego had become kind of insular over the years. That Lego in 2002, 2001 was very much of, we know what's best. We're going to reinvent the future. We're going to really create some great toys for kids. And we care about this and we know how to do it and we're going to do it. Lego, after its crash, adopted many of the principles that you're learning in this course and said, we don't know. And so we're going to go out and we're going to continually interact and understand how kids play, what they're drawn to. We're going to create some ideas based on that. We still develop our own ideas. We don't depend on crowdsourcing. It's just one line of business for Lego. But we're going to continually test the ideas that we think are good ones. And if they turn out to be good ones, if kids say that, yes, this is what we want, then we'll bring those to market. And that's been very successful for Lego. In recent years, they've been doing some amazing stuff for adults. They've realized that adult fans of Lego are quite a significant market and buy, on average, much more Lego than families with kids do. You can see behind me 2 examples, right? These flowers are made out of Lego. This map of the world behind me is made out of Lego. These are 2 of the recent adult sets that Lego has brought out. And the sets for adults are doing really very well now. And they're bringing a whole new stream of revenue in. I'm just looking at some of the questions now. What about Lego Serious Play? Jose asked. They're getting money from that. It's not a big source of revenue for a company like Lego. Those of you not familiar, Lego Serious Play is a business intervention, and there's a training program about it. And you teach how to facilitate meetings through having people build things. So, build your nightmare team member, build the barriers to success of your new business venture. And it can be quite successful, especially in some cultures. Rashmi asks, the immersive Galador was a good concept that could have been adopted when they released Lego Batman. They would have needed to do a better TV show. And also, it wasn't very Lego-y. The action figure wasn't very Lego-y. But the idea of using ultrasonic signals, I think, could have succeeded. So I think I think that's worth another round of experiments. I don't know why they haven't gone back to it, Rashmi. Sam Roach asks, how did Mindstorms fit into this story? Mindstorms is their robotics platform. And Mindstorms really taught them quite a lot about the value, about the sophistication and the expertise in the community. It's Mindstorms that led them to the Lego Ideas crowdsourcing, because Mindstorms the team that developed the robotics platform that came out in 2006, really didn't have a lot of resources available to it. They're still recovering from the brush with bankruptcy. And so they had to depend on their community. And they learned about how sophisticated the community was. And they started involving the community in a much more structured way. And so Mindstorms taught them about the value of the community. And since then, it's been a much more two-way conversation. So Mindstorms fits into it in an important way. Oh, yeah, absolutely, Jean-Paul. Meccano could have learned a lot. Let me also, by the way, do a shameless plug for a course that I do, which is basically 2 days on this approach to innovation. And I think this QR code is still working. I just put it in right at the end. So I'm going to just make sure that it's still. It should take you to the course website. But if you're interested in spending 2 days on this, there's a discount code. And you can spend 2 days talking about this approach to innovation, how you innovate around the box. That's, I see we're out of time. But just generally, my challenge to you, you're all working on some design thinking exercise, developing some product, service, app, something like that. And what I'd challenge you to do is to think about 2 or 3 complementary innovations that you would introduce alongside your product or service that would help your target customers get more value from that product or service. And I think what you'll find when you do that thought experiment is it forces you to take a more broad view of your customer. It forces you to really think through what it is that you are providing to them. And when you do that, often you end up getting some more features or functions for your core product. So that's my challenge to you. What complementary innovations could you think of? And when you do that, maybe some of them you can apply, or some of them would result in new features or functions for your core product. So that's the story of Lego. Back to you, Brian.
Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for spending the time with us. You can learn a little bit more about Dave if you want to go to his website, robertsoninnovation.com. You can see quite a bit more about his work there, and there's a lot of great info on the web page. So another shameless plug for you, but I'll put that in there so folks can learn about you.
Thank you, Brian.
So thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, program support, for a smooth session, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you so much, David,
All right.
for your time today. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. How about that? Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, you too. Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Dave. Take care. Great to see you again.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your support.